Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. Today, we are going to discuss Trust by Hernan Diaz. So this is a book that I will admit that I picked up, probably when it first came out, and read a bit of the way into it, and have to say that I put it aside. I am very, very happy that when it came out in paperback, which I think was recently, I went back to it. And I'm so glad that I did. It is a book that I'm just seeing everywhere on all of the independent bookstore front tables. I'm seeing it a lot in airports, which is interesting. I think maybe people on airplanes want to dive into like a big fat book like this. So I've been very happy to see it pushed so much because, in fact, I think it is in lots of ways a really good book for all Americans to read. But I also am very happy that it has gotten all of the prizes that it has won. It's kind of remarkable. So in 2022, it was longlisted for the Booker Prize. So I myself am kind of a Booker Prize gal. The Booker tends to be kind of a more literary prize, whereas the Pulitzer tends to be a little more, not necessarily journalistic. I actually think the panel who decides the Pulitzer maybe has a lot of journalists on it, but it tends to be slightly more rewarding of storytelling, whereas the Booker, this is on my opinion, but I think it's grounded in fact. But the Booker is, in fact, it's more concerned with the language itself. But this book did win the Pulitzer Prize. So, and Hernan Diaz has gotten a Whiting Award, and his last book, called In the Distance, also, I believe, was either shortlisted or longlisted for the Pulitzer. So, this is a book that a lot of people have been talking about recently, and I think that is it's kind of an important aspect of the book because this is essentially 4 books in one. And I think what might be happening for those of you who maybe haven't gotten fully sucked in is that if you only read into the first book and you're not anticipating the other 3, and if that first book, which is very stylistically specific, doesn't totally speak to you, then you might be tempted to not continue. I am such a big believer in not continuing books. So anyone out there who wants permission to just stop reading something, absolutely, I am granting you permission. Life is too short and there are way too many books out there. I also must admit that I was totally taken by the cover. The cover is just, it's really doing a lot for me. The last reason I was interested in reading this is that I knew that Hernan Diaz was Argentine. I don't know if it's Argentine or Argentinian. Maybe it's both. I can never remember which one it is. He was born in Argentina and was a native Spanish speaker, but although he grew up in Sweden for a big chunk of his childhood, but which is kind of like unusual and interesting to me, and then came to New York eventually for studies. But he is a Spanish speaker who has chosen to write in English. So very famously, Nabokov did that. He grew up speaking French and Russian and wrote quite a bit in Russian and in French, but then decided to write almost exclusively in English. And I am really glad that he did. And it's actually astonishing to look at his prose and realize that this is like his 4th language or something. Also, very famously, Joseph Conrad has chosen to write in English. There are some writers too, like Beckett, who was Irish and decided to write in French. I think there is a tradition of wanting, for many different reasons, to write in a different language. But I was interested in this because I really wanted to see, how this might affect his prose. And I'm not really sure I found any good reasons, and there's no real reason to believe that you could tell, but I was interested. Okay, so those of you who like an agenda, here's the agenda. We're going to begin with a very brief bio of Hernan Diaz. Then we're going to dive in. We'll look more closely at the cover. We'll look at the title, and we will look at the opening pages. We're then going to talk about the structure of the book. I mentioned that there are 4 books in one. This book is a bit tricky to talk about without spoilers, but I am going to do that today. And part of that means that I can't really dig in to the ending of the book as much as I would like. But I think there are ways that we can talk about the structure of the book without giving too much away. In fact, we're not giving away anything that the careful reader wouldn't notice by simply looking at the table of contents. We're going to talk a little bit about the cyclical nature of this book and of history and of finance and of generational, growth and evolution or lack thereof. Then we're going to talk about the role of women in the novel. In terms of biography, Hernan Diaz was born in 1973 in Buenos Aires, and I've been watching a lot of interviews, listening to some podcasts featuring him, and then also watching some on YouTube, and he is the most charming, most articulate, he's so good looking, he seems very, sweet, and actually, he was on a YouTube channel thing with Dua Lipa, which I just didn't know that she had a whole book channel. I've got to check it out. They had a really great interview. So a lot of the information that I will be giving you today comes from interviews, but I was just so struck by him. He seemed so young to me, but it turns out that he's only 4 years younger than I am, which was really surprising. So he was born in 1973. When he was 2 years old, there was a military coup in Argentina, so his family went to Sweden. And then when he was 10 years old, they went back to Argentina. He went to the University of Buenos Aires and then got a master's degree at King's College in London. And then at 26 years old, he moved in 1999. He moved to New York City, went to NYU, and got a PhD at that point in a kind of an amalgam of comparative literature, Latin American literature, and philosophy. So for those of you who have already finished Trust, that is not surprising. He is someone who just is really incredibly well-read and who has a lot of, complet and philosophy just sort of at his fingertips, at least that seems that way from the writing itself. He now lives in Brooklyn with his wife and daughter and is an assistant professor at Columbia, I believe, in Latin American studies. So this comparative literature background plays into the way that he prepares for writing any of his works. And he said that what he does is the first thing, well, not the very first thing. First he has the idea and, ruminates for a while, but he builds a library. And essentially he starts reading, and he reads just voraciously and sort of exhaustively on any subject. And I think that you could have guessed that by reading Trust, even if you did not know that was the case. There are citations, not actual bibliographical citations, but he is citing many, many, many authors throughout. And I loved that. I loved the idea that this book is in fact based on some very real heavyweight, both literature and historical figures. It is a novel. It has that little boilerplate thing that says, that all of these, people are figments, not figments, are from the author's imagination, and anything else is any coincidence is just a coincidence, which is always interesting to me when you actually have historical figures. But the point is that Hernan Diaz has written a novel that purports to be essentially four different documents all in one, but they are fictive. And speaking of reading, there are a couple of different characters in the book who really love detective stories. And in fact, they talked about Dorothy Sayers, who is one of my favorite detective writers. Agatha Christie too. I also really love her. With this, I think he has said that he hopes the reader is essentially becoming a kind of detective, a kind of literary detective. And I actually think it would have been very helpful to know that from the start, that essentially one of the tasks of the reader here is to sort of piece this whole thing together and to become somewhat of a detective. Okay, we're now going to go ahead and dive in. I'm going to show you, those of you who are watching on the YouTube, I've got my copy of Trust right up here, but I think you can, even if you don't have your copy with you, you can remember it. It's really beautiful, I think. You've got this kind of aquamarine background, and you have a building that it looks to me very New York. It's not identifiably, like the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building, but and it's actually kind of craggy and kind of it looks a little bit medieval, and it looks a little bit Gothic, which I think is absolutely perfect. Also, interestingly, it's all kind of on top of a cloud cover. The building is kind of growing out of either dense fog or some sort of cloud, which I think is pointing us to the fact that we are meant to believe that this is all fiction. So all of this is a fiction. All of it is precarious. All of it is a bit foggy. Also, it's very important to note that this building is inside a bell jar. So whenever I see a bell jar, of course, I think of Sylvia Plath and the bell jar. But this idea of examining something, that's essentially what a bell jar would be for. You have this idea of the building, and thereby, if we look at this as kind of metonymic, I think that's metonymic of New York, we have this idea of examining New York. There is also an absolutely beautiful line at the end of the book in a section that we aren't going to be able to discuss too in depth, but there is a line in that section that says, "A bell inside a bell jar won't ring." So I loved the reference toward the very, very end of the book, the reference to the bell jar that we see on the cover. I like the idea of sort of bookends. And I do think this is a cover that we are meant to kind of dig into, again, in the spirit of being, kind of a reading detective. Also, of course, writers don't have a ton of authority over the cover. I don't know if he was involved at all. Usually, the publicists and the marketing people do that, which is usually a very good thing. But I do imagine that the people who are responsible for this understood the importance of some of these symbols that they were incorporating on the front of the novel. I also really love that if you look closely, it's almost like a watermark. They're like these little wavy lines that to me look like the kind of stuff that maybe it's even on the dollar bill or, our American money. It is kind of also sort of the color of money, the book, but it also it's maybe like the back of a check, that kind of thing. To me, it feels very kind of mercenary. This the like wavy lines on the back of the cover. And I have to say that if I like the cover art, I like the title even more. Oh gosh, guys, I also, for anyone on YouTube, I'm just going to have to make the remark here that I got a little off-piste with the self-tanner. If you're looking at my hand and wondering why it looks dirty, that is actually not like dirt. That is self-tanner gone wrong. Okay, so we have this title that I really, really love. So there's the idea, of course, of finance, the idea of a trust, that you have money in a trust, which I actually have never really stopped to think about what that means. But having money in trust essentially means that it's going, it's not available to certain people and is essentially promised to them either when they are older or to future generations. So I like this idea of kind of that you trust that this money is, is being held for you. There's kind of a mutual trust, provided that everyone knows about the trust. It's also speaking to this generational wealth that we have in the United States. Frankly, it's also speaking to all of the many, many ways that people get out of paying taxes and that the rich get richer and the wealthier, are able to really grow their wealth. So this idea of a monetary trust is obviously very important. For me, that was the first kind of connotation, when I saw the cover of it. Again, I think because of that building and because to me it spoke of New York, it did make me think of a monetary trust. But of course, there is also the idea of the verb, to trust someone. So you have this idea, this kind of interpersonal thing. And this is a book that is full of deceit and full of betrayal. So the idea of trusting one another is very, very important. And then there is this really cool idea that the reader has to trust. So part of it is trusting that the first book, which is about 120 pages long, is only one section. So you have to kind of trust that there is going to be this much richer payoff in the third and fourth sections especially. But so you have this idea of the reader needing to kind of trust and to sort of wade into this trusting that things are going to change. And if you're not necessarily loving that first section, that there's going to be some sort of variety. But Hernan Diaz talked, I think it was actually with Dua Lipa, which again, I think is so funny. He talked about the idea of the reader trusting certain pieces of writing. So that when you have, these are, I think, what he named in the thing, where if you're reading the information on a prescription pill bottle, that is different than if you are reading, something that is in the news, which is obviously problematic these days, versus a novel or a historical document. So he's talking about the ways that readers have different levels of trust. And I would take that one step further and kind of posit the idea that you also, even when you're reading fiction, you need to trust certain things about the way that something is constructed and what an author is doing for you. So this idea of maybe trusting that the author is not going to like have a whole bunch of red herrings or isn't going to, suddenly stop the novel halfway through. There are all of these different ways that we trust the conventions of fiction in ways that I think add to this idea of trust. So as a title, it is phenomenal. I just think it is so good. I also love that it's just the one word. I also love how it focuses our attention on trust and betrayal, and the way that it applies to all four of essentially the books that are in, and in fact, in some of them, trust is more important than others. But you have this idea of it kind of blanketing the whole thing while also really helping us focus our attention. It's such a good title. We are now going to open up the book. And I actually love about a book like this that almost every sort of aspect, even some of the kind of more boilerplate stuff, is really interesting. And again, if we are acting like the good literary detective that Hernan Diaz wants us to be, we should be paying attention even to some of this kind of frontis matter. So in the beginning, we have the praise for trust, and then we have this very impressive thing about how it was longlisted for the 2022 Booker. It was winner of the Kirkus Prize, which is a very big deal. It was one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2022 and one of the Washington Post 10 best books of 2022. So, this is a book that was getting a lot of attention in 2022 and in fact continues to. Maybe the Pulitzer was last year. I'm not sure. Then we have like a zillion blurbs from all of these very big publications and big readers, which, I mean, honestly, I do think I'm glad it's getting all of this attention because, in fact, I think it's encouraging readers, to persevere, where some of them, I think, would perhaps fall short. It is important here, in this case, to look at this page here that says, also by Hernan Diaz, In the Distance. So this is a book I have not read. It is about the Wild Wild West. It's reimagining the Western. And it's interesting. He talks in an interview about the American penchant for folklore and how we have this real appetite for heroics and we have this real appetite, for legends and legendary role models. So the idea of the Western certainly has everything to do with American individualism and manifest destiny and all of these things that I think we should be very carefully examining, and lots of which I have very large problems with. But he talks about how In the Distance and the Western was sort of the beginning of the capitalist machine sort of getting up and running. So it would have had to do with with the Western expansion and with the railroads, and that trust, which is a bit later in time, is really once that machine is kind of going full steam, if you will. So it's really up and running, and not only are the railroads and the oil and all of the trade, of tobacco and cotton and all of these different, slavery dependent commodities, not only is all of that up and running, but in fact, New York has begun to be this finance machine where essentially finance is just beginning to sort of run on finance. You have all of these things about shorting stocks and futures and all of these different, I don't know if futures is the same thing, but you have this idea that money starts making money and that all of the investments and playing the stock market, all of the ways that essentially finance becomes divorced from any kind of actual practice. It's not about steel and it's not about cotton. It is, in fact, very much about just making more money out of your money. So it's really interesting, and not that you would know this, I'm just filling you in, interesting to look at this idea of Hernan Diaz as having written a book about the West and then having really focused on this kind of, 20s and 30s, which was this other huge time of American, myth making. We then have a very straightforward title page, Trust, Hernan Diaz. And then we're not gonna look at this boilerplate stuff. It's really pretty straightforward. And then he has the dedication to Anne, Elsa, Marina, and Anna. I actually don't know who Marina and Anna are, but Anne and Elsa, I gather from the acknowledgments, I believe, are probably his wife and daughter. So we are then going to move on to an extremely important page, which is the table of contents. So in some books, the table of contents is not as important as others. Most literary fiction, if they are giving you a table of contents, as a careful reader, you should definitely pay attention. Sometimes it will signal to you that, in fact, these different chapters that you're about to embark on stand alone as short stories. If they have titles, that's important in the sense that each of them sort of has a controlling idea and not just a page number and a chapter number. So what we have here in this very important table of contents is the following. We have the 4 books named. Bonds by Harold Vanner, and that is about 124 pages long. Then we have My Life by Andrew Bevel, which is about 70 pages long. Then we have a memoir, Remembered, by Ida Partenza, which is about 170 pages long. And then we close with Futures by Mildred Bevel. So if the careful reader is taking a look here, the careful reader will notice a few things. One is that Andrew Bevel and Mildred Bevel each are, going to have their say, which is, in fact, very important. You also get a sense Harold Vanner, Andrew Bevel, these sound like very kind of highfalutin names. And then we have Ida Partenza, who is, in fact, an Italian immigrant. So right away, you have this idea of a group of people who are going to be significant. So again, it's very important to take a look at these. In fact, we are going to look at each one of the title pages. So here we have Bonds, a novel by Harold Vanner. I mean, honestly, here we could spend a whole other, 5 minutes talking about the title. It's very much an echo of trust. Of course, bonds, government bonds is a very safe way to have your money saved, which is interesting because, this is an exploration of how Andrew Bevel was either safe or not safe in terms of his investing life. Andrew Bevel, who has the second part, is the one who is fictionally depicted in the first novel. So Bonds, a novel by Harold Vanner, is a book that concerns a guy named Benjamin Rask, but Benjamin Rask is very clearly based on Andrew Bevel. So, but of course, we also have the idea of bonds as being like interpersonal bonds, and bonds as being made to be broken. All of these different connotations should, in fact, be registering for you. So the idea of bonds as being a novel is also very important. I have to say, part of me was a little impatient with this because I was like, wait, why are we kicking off with a different novel? I mean, I wasn't like that impatient yet, but the idea of beginning with a piece of fiction is an interesting way to go about this. So, but very importantly, this idea of history as fiction, and frankly, the idea of finance as fiction, are huge themes for Hernan Diaz. So if we look at page 217, this is a section that's actually in the third book, the one by Ida Partenza, but it is a real study of fiction and this idea of fiction. This is when Ida, who is going to write the memoir in the third book, is having a conversation with her father, who is an Italian immigrant and who is, he likes Marx. He's not into Marxism, but he really believes in Karl Marx. Ida speaks first. But if they trade in fictions, how can they be criminal? Fictions are supposed to be harmless, aren't they? Fiction harmless? Look at religion. Fiction harmless? Look at the oppressed masses content with their lot because they have embraced the lies imposed on them. History itself is just a fiction with an army. And reality? Reality is a fiction with an unlimited budget. That's what it is. And how is reality funded? With yet another fiction, money. Money is at the core of it all, an illusion we've all agreed to support unanimously. So if we are following our table of contents a bit like a map, we can go to the second title page, which is My Life, which is by Andrew Bevel. So you have this idea here of a memoir. And in fact, on the next page, we have another table of contents. You're getting a sense of the sort of intricacy and the careful structuring of this novel. And then we have the next part, which is a memoir remembered by Ida Partenza. And then finally, of course, we have futures, which is another one of these kind of finance words. So we have trust and bonds and futures, all of which are financial terms, but also, of course, mean other things. So this table of contents is doing a huge amount of work. And hopefully, as a careful reader, you took a second to dive into that. Okay, we are now going to take a look at the very beginning of the book. Because he had enjoyed almost every advantage since birth, one of the few privileges denied to Benjamin Rask was that of a heroic rise. His was not a story of resilience and perseverance or the tale of an unbreakable will forging a golden destiny for itself out of little more than dross. According to the back of the Rask family Bible, in 1662 his father's ancestors had migrated from Copenhagen to Glasgow, where they started trading in tobacco from the colonies. Over the next century, their business prospered and expanded to the extent that part of the family moved to America so they could better oversee their suppliers and control every aspect of production. 3 generations later, Benjamin's father, Solomon, bought out all of his relatives and outside investors. Under his sole direction, the company kept flourishing, and it did not take him long to become one of the most prominent tobacco traders on the eastern seaboard. Wow, my hair was just looking crazy that whole time. Apologies. So in some ways, the most important thing this is doing is really articulating the American dream. This is something that we have been talking about on the Fox page for a long time. When we were in kind of a Norwegian phase or a Scandinavian phase, and we were reading a bunch of books from Scandinavia, I kept wondering kind of like, what is the Scandinavian dream? What is the Danish dream? Or what is the Norwegian dream? So this American dream is very specific. It has everything to do with like Horatio Alger and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and individualism and competition. And first and foremost, it is rags to riches. So there's this idea here that he articulates very carefully, forging a golden destiny for itself out of little more than dross. So, that speaks a little bit to the gold rush. It speaks to, extraction mining and the abuse that we leveled on this country, not to mention the indigenous peoples. This is, speaking here about colonization. It's, hinting a bit at westward expansion. There are many, many ways that this is really articulating very well the idea of American exceptionalism and the importance of money and of trade right from the very beginning. I mean, some of this stuff, 1662, I mean, this is well before any kind of independence. So this was still in the colonial era. Already we were having, the forging of these generations that in fact became these gigantic holders of wealth. Now that we've gotten a bit of a sense of this very first book, I want to talk about the structure of the novel. So Hernan Diaz is very clear about the fact that he views these 4 texts as different texts. The first is very clearly a novel. The second is a memoir. The third he calls a historical document, and the last he calls a diary or a journal. So this is a very important distinction, and this again goes back to this idea of trust. It goes, to the roots of his comparative literature background. So you have this idea at the beginning of this novel, which we just read the beginning of it. It's about Benjamin Rask. This idea of it being a fiction, and really in many ways it is in order to create this legend. It is also, it turns out, a way to create a scapegoat. So, just as Americans really love their creation of their legends and their heroes, they also, in fact, love a good scapegoat. So that is part of what is happening here. We are also suckers, for sensational tragedy. So there's a bit of that here, too, that it turns out is a bit trumped up, potentially. Oh, speaking of Trump and trumped up, Hernan Diaz did, in fact, say that this was a book that was written during the Trump pregnancy. Wow. Wow. Written during the Trump presidency, and that he was given by President Trump this real, sort of primer in how to essentially make your own facts out of fiction. And he also was given a very good model for the bluster that we actually see in the second book. So the first is this novel by someone named Harold Vanner. The second one is a memoir, and it is written by Andrew Bevel. Diaz talked about the fact that he did tons and tons of reading of the biography of these men, these big sort of, the steel magnates and these titans of industry and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and all of those people who truly are, those are names that are legendary for all of us. So he talked about reading all of those memoirs, and almost to a memoir, he got this sense of just incredible bombast and incredible self-importance, and this real conviction that these men's voices needed to be heard. So there's this idea, that there's like this incredible kind of narcissism here, and the sense that like these people are speaking truths, and in explaining how they have made or maintained or grown their money, that is inherently interesting to all Americans. But this idea of this bluster that all of these men have, Hernan Diaz very specifically said that Trump was a very good model for this kind of bluster, and frankly, for the fiction of being a self-made man. So that is another, sort of truism that comes out in both the first novel and then also in the memoir by Andrew Bevel, which is this idea of being a self-made man. And that is also, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. That is, this kind of individualism and competition as being so inherently American, this idea of these men as being self-made, which is totally ridiculous, of course, because many of them, if not all of these people that I just mentioned, they are products of incredible generational wealth. So then we move on in terms of a structure to this third book. And again, this is where my interest was really piqued. He calls it a historical document. And in some ways, I think it kind of is a historical document, but I also think that it really can be read kind of as a memoir. She is, in fact, doing, some sort of sleuthing. And we know, in fact, that Ida Partenza is a successful journalist. So you have this sense of it's kind of like investigative reporting and a little bit of research, but it also read to me very much like a memoir. And then, honestly, my appreciation of this book kept growing and growing with every one of the sections. The fourth section was far and away my favorite. It was so beautifully done. And honestly, some of this kind of bombastic prose, it's kind of that school of realism, it's just not that interesting to me. And then in the last section, it was just so haunting. And I was listening to it in the car driving around, and I found it so difficult to listen to just because it was so heartfelt. Interestingly, they have a different narrator, which it was actually a voice that I liked much more. But we have this really very beautifully fragmented and very personal and very sort of it's very like impression heavy and very non-plot oriented, and it's a very poignant time. But we have this beautiful, beautiful piece of writing at the very end in the fourth part. And perhaps it is not surprising that I liked the last part best, because Hernan Diaz also talked about how the work in his novel was sort of following along the historical development of literature. So what we have in the very beginning is this kind of high realism, kind of the end of realism. And he talks about having read a bunch of Upton Sinclair and reading he read some Theodore Dreiser, and Dreiser has some stuff about economics. Certainly Upton Sinclair does. He read Edith Wharton and he read Henry James, all of these American writers toward the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th. And then as we are moving through, we get to this kind of high modernism. And in fact, Virginia Woolf is evoked in that fourth one in a way that is so beautiful. The novel that is referred to as Flush, and that is a novel that Virginia Woolf wrote about Elizabeth Barrett Browning's spaniel. And it is such a good book. I mean, this sounds like a book that should be really bad, like it's told from the perspective of a dog, but it is so, so beautifully done. So I really loved this kind of evolution in the prose toward this high modernist thing at the end, which I thought was actually so beautiful. It makes me think that Diaz's work, that his sort of talents are best shown in a more modernist kind of setting, and not so much in the realist setting of the first two books. So we are going to look a bit more closely at some of the samples of prose from these sections. And again, I will not give anything away. On page 8, we have an example of this realist prose. You're going to see it, I think, right away, especially if you've listened to the Fox page about realism. Realism, it was a sort of a movement that wanted to include everything in it. Flaubert was the first kind of, well, not necessarily the first, but he's sort of one of the main practitioners of it. And oftentimes it is a third-person narrator who sometimes will enter into the minds of different characters, but often is pulled way, way back. We have this paragraph on page 8. At the height of his success, Solomon had a townhouse built on West 17th Street, which was finished just in time for Benjamin's birth. Yet Solomon was seldom to be seen in the New York family residence. His work took him from one plantation to another, and he was always supervising rolling rooms or visiting business associates in Virginia, North Carolina, and the Caribbean. He even owned a small hacienda in Cuba, where he passed the greater part of each winter. Rumors concerning his life on the island established his reputation as an adventurer with a taste for the exotic, which was an asset in his line of business. So I have in the marginalia here ew, like with lots of e's. I had to write that a lot. There was a lot of like ew in the margins for me, because so much of the gross bombast in the first two books ends up feeling very misogynistic. This idea here of an adventurer and liking the exotic it's really repugnant. So one of the things you will find is that each one of these books is sort of a reflection back on the books beforehand. So this first book is establishing a certain vision, and then that vision shifts according to the different books that are coming. But here, this is this very good example. He's describing the entire life of this guy Solomon, who is one of Benjamin Rask's forebears. Interesting that Rask is very close to Trask, which is, the family in East of Eden. But so you have this idea here of this very realist approach to language. Then we're going to look on page 73. We are still in this first section, but this is a slightly different sort of embodiment of this narrator. Most of us prefer to believe we are the active subjects of our victories, but only the passive objects of our defeat. We triumph, but it is not really we who fail. We are ruined by forces beyond our control. So this here, this is the first person plural. This we, I is the first person singular, and we is the first person plural. It's interesting the way that here, it's again this very authoritative, omniscient narrator who is sort of sneakily implicating the reader with this we. We prefer to believe that we're responsible for our victories and that we are not responsible for our defeats. This is this kind of like big proclamation of these kind of virtues and these truisms that you see throughout, which is, again, one of the hallmarks of the realist writing, that you have these kind of pronouncements and these truisms that are made. We're going to look at 127. This is when we are into the second book, which is a refutation of the first in many ways by Andrew Bevel, who was the fictional Benjamin Rask in the first time. So we do have, this is in the first person, this memoir, which, that is typical. In fact, it is being ghostwritten, which is an important element. But we have this idea of the first person as being a bit more upfront about what it is that his goal is here. And a lot of it feels very disingenuous. So on 132, we have this idea of what he's trying to do, but we have another articulation of the American dream that is very much like the articulation in the first book. Importantly, this is being written in 1938, so end of the Depression, and 9 years after the crash of the stock market in 29. Importantly, this is coming from the preface that Andrew Bevel is writing before he is diving into his actual memoir. So we have this. I offer my wife's loving portrait, resigned to knowing it shall fail to fully honor her dignity, candor, and grace. One further reason has moved me to gather my thoughts and recollections into this book. For about a decade now, I have witnessed a woeful decline not only in the business of our country, but also in the spirit of its people. Where perseverance and ingenuity once dwelled, apathy and despair now loiter. Where self-reliance reigned, beggarly submission now squats. The working man is reduced to a panhandler. A vicious circle has taken hold of our able-bodied men. They increasingly rely on the government to alleviate the misery created by that same government, not realizing that this dependency only perpetuates their sorry state of affairs. My hope is that these pages will serve as a reminder of the unflagging boldness that has hitherto defined our people. I also hope my words will steel the reader not only against the regrettable conditions of our time, but also against any form of coddling. Perhaps this book will help my fellow countrymen remember that it is through the sum of daring individual actions that this nation has risen above all others, and that our greatness comes only from the free interplay of singular wills. So here in the margin, I have yuck and ugh written. This is such a repellent, for me, this is a very repellent kind of, bunch of statements that he is making here. And we're not going to look at this closely, but this idea of beggarly submission now squats, the idea of the words beggar and squatting, in the sense of squatting on someone else's property, all of that is kind of inherent in this. It's a very judgy thing. And of course, the irony in all of this is that this is someone who has extreme wealth. I mean, it is so ironic to read this after having finished the book, because there are lots and lots of pieces of the puzzle that the reader doesn't have yet. And once you have those pieces of the puzzle, this becomes even more repellent in lots of ways. But this idea of individuals as having, made our country into the best in the world, I mean, which is just such a ridiculous idea in the first place. So this whole section here is giving us a sense of what this memoir is all about. And in many ways, especially in the beginning when he's talking about his wife, what he is seeking to do is to sort of refute all of the allegations that are brought up in the first novel, Bonds. We're going to take a very brief look at the actual memoir itself. This is a memoir written by Andrew Bevel, and it's on page 135. We have the first chapter, which is called Ancestry, which, I mean, right there, like this idea of going from like all of this rhetoric about like the individual and how, we need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And then literally the first, chapter of his memoir is Ancestry. So it's so hypocritical. Okay, if we look on 135, I am a financier in a city ruled by financiers. My father was a financier in a city ruled by industrialists. His father was a financier in a city ruled by merchants. His father was a financier in a city ruled by a tight-knit society, indolent and priggish, like most provincial aristocracies. These four cities are one and the same, New York. So I really liked the idea of New York. I mean, this is very like Gilded Age, which is just kind of fun. I was a little bit disappointed in that television show. I really wanted to love it, but I don't know why. It just felt like a tiny bit thin to me. Still fun to watch, though, for sure. See, look at me being seduced by like the idea of these families, like wanting to learn about like, oh, are they based on the Vanderbilts or the Rockefellers? Or I mean, it's just, it's absurd in many ways. But I am not immune to it, which is interesting and kind of a bummer. Okay, but here we have this idea of these financiers, 4 generations in New York City, of this idea of building money on top of money. And again, this is how he's kicking off this memoir. So the tone of Diaz's novel really shifts when we get to the part written by Ida Partenza. So one of the interesting things, if you're listening to this on Audible, there are big chunks of the Ida Partenza part that are in italics, and you can't tell that from when you are listening to it. And it's actually kind of important because these italicized parts are happening in 1981, and the parts that are in Roman type are in fact happening back in the 30s. It's too bad there's not a way to easily, show that that writing is in fact in italics. But I really liked this idea of this woman who's going to kind of straighten things out for us by doing some research, and also by having 50 years of experience with which to judge what had happened in the 30s. Importantly, Diaz also says that in many ways he thought of Ida Partenza as a new journalist. So the new journalism was a movement in the 60s and 70s. It's people like Joan Didion and Tom Wolfe and Hunter S. Thompson. They're people who, instead of like pretending like an omniscient, invisible reporter is giving you a story, what in fact they're doing is, inserting themselves and using many literary devices as they are writing something that can be verified in all of the normal journalistic ways. So we have this real shift, and it was welcomed by me. This is on page 195. It's the beginning of Ida Partenza's memoir. The paneled doors, shut to most of the world for decades, are now open to the public Tuesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. For years, I avoided the main entrance to Bevel House on 87th Street between Madison and Fifth Avenue. Now and then, walking through the park, I would catch a glimpse of the building's top floor through the foliage. The limestone darkening with the seasons, the blinds closed regardless of them. So this is a section that is also told in the first person, and anyone who's a writer out there, or even any readers, when you have a first person narration, it's kind of fun to think, why this person and why now? So we know why this person, because in fact, we realize that she has a large role that she had played in the writing of some of these texts. And then also, though, the reason why this is happening now has to do with the idea that the house, this Bevel House, was being opened as a museum at this point in 1981, which allows her access to these historical documents that she wants to examine. So I really enjoyed both her narrative voice, but also the way that it grounds us in a future time in 1981, and also the sort of promise that things are going to get a little straightened out. In the interest of not spoiling any part of the book, the only thing I want to read from the very last section is just this little part about Virginia Woolf's novel Flush. So this is on page 384. We're obviously toward the end of the book, and I'm not going to tell you too much about it. Just read it so you can have a sense of the modernist flair. Reading Flush. Superb, even if dog's perspective is inconsistent, which I find distracting. The dog's loving submission to its bedridden mistress is wonderfully suffocating. So we have a bunch of things here that feel very modernist. In part, we have these fragments. The first two sentences are fragmentary. You can hear how very, very different this first-person narration is, because she's talking about her own opinions, she's talking about sensations, she's talking about the body, this idea of suffocating, and it's an unusual use of that word. So you have all of these ways in which it differs even from the memoir, where we have like a very straightforward narration on the part of both Andrew Bevel in his memoir and then Ida Partenza in hers. Interestingly, Diaz said that this book began as a linear book. It was going to be just this very straightforward book, speaking of linear narration, but instead it kind of, fragmented apart into these different sections. And I'm very glad it did, because I find this the most redeeming and most interesting part about the work. So now we're going to talk somewhat briefly about this notion of one of the other things that kind of structure the book, and it is this idea of circularity or cycles, and the idea of repetition and echoes and refutation. So you, of course, have this book one, and then book two is essentially a refutation. And so a lot of what happens in book two is you have stories that feel familiar to you because, in fact, you have heard like a version of these stories in the first one. I actually found that a tiny bit tedious. At some point I was like, okay, what's with all these repetitions? And they didn't seem kind of different enough. And you can understand why that is the case. In this case, it's, two very wealthy white men. Actually, I'm not sure Harold Vanner is super wealthy. And, you careful reader, you should look for ways in which Harold Vanner is popping up elsewhere in the book. That's just like a little teaser for you. Don't want to spoil anything. But this idea of these men who are very interested in, like vast wealth and these financiers, you have somewhat similar depictions in the two of them. And then, of course, we have different stories that come up again in the third part and come up again in the fourth part. In the third and fourth parts, I found them much more interesting, in large part because of the narration, but also because they felt sort of substantively different. And I felt like I was getting a much richer understanding of them, and also a more nuanced understanding that wasn't quite as like misogynist and capitalist and just kind of gross. Okay, the other thing, one other way that it's kind of circular is this idea of history repeating itself. And this is far more important. So you have this idea of, he talked about the generations, and one of the chapters is called Ancestry. There's this idea of history repeating itself over and over and over. And, part of that has to do, again, with generational wealth, and how certainly here in the United States, there is this way that it really is propagating itself. I looked for so long for this one quotation. I could not find it. In the book about how, like the New York kind of capitalist machine is like a snake eating its own tail. And you can imagine, I think there's a name for that. Oh gosh, it just went right out of my head. But there's that snake that's eating its own tail. So you have this sense of everything cycling. We also, and this is very important, have this idea of these financial cycles that the United States goes through. I mean, they kept talking about, the big crash or the big kind of reset or crash of 1922, which of course we are all very familiar with 29. And the depression that followed. But he also talks about a depression in the 19th century. And we know this. I mean, we know this because right now, some of us, not necessarily me, although sometimes I like listening to Marketplace on NPR, which really makes me feel kind of out of my depth, but I like it. But, you have this idea here of the Fed and regulations, and you have the idea of recession and depression. And, not that long ago, in 2008, we had that big crisis. And then I think in 2001, maybe, there was another big crisis. So you have this idea of finance as being highly cyclical, which is really cool. And I mean, that's not that cool, but the way that Hernan Diaz is treating it in his book is very cool, because a lot of what is cyclical in the book is in fact highlighting the way that both history through generations and wealth is in fact a very cyclical thing. The last thing that we are going to do today is take a look at the role of women in the novel. So Hernan Diaz is very clear about the fact that women are really not part of the financial world in terms of these fictions. I mean, they're also not part of the financial world in many different ways. I was so surprised he had a part in here about the popularity of trading stocks in the 20s. And there was some statistic that I'm not going to cite it because I'll get it wrong, but like, I'm going to try to cite it. It's like 40% or something of people who were trading stocks were women, which I was shocked by that. But Hernan Diaz, don't trust me, but definitely trust him, because that guy is a major researcher. So you have this sense of women as being excluded from kind of this myth making, except in the philanthropic zone. But what we have here in this book, I mean, talk about refutation, we really have a centering of women that is so satisfying. And you have to get through, the first two books, which feel very misogynist and are very kind of diminishing and belittling of women in many, many ways. But then we have this real kind of flourishing and this real sort of centering, again, of women. So we're going to take a look at just 3 examples. These come more toward the end of the book because they come once we have Ida telling her story, and then once we have Mildred Bevel telling hers. So if we look on page 210, this is very early and it's just a very quick little snippet, but it's this idea that simply of Ida Partenza as being a very successful journalist. So this is in the 30s and she wants to get a job and her father does not approve. One of the things, like a little quibble that I had with the book, is no one seems to ever have any children. And there was one, reference at one point, I don't know, it was like Mildred's health was delicate or something. But there was a sort of noticeable lack of any siblings or any children being born to anyone. So we know eventually that Ida is going to become this successful journalist because we meet her in 1981. But I like the way that her father is both supportive of her career and also really not supportive of her career. So he doesn't want her to leave him for many reasons and is not happy when she gets this secretarial job. But also his comment on it is interesting. Importantly, it's the end of a chapter, so it feels kind of extra resonant. We have this. My father disapproved. Secretary was a demeaning occupation, he said. It promised independence, but was another knot in the millenary subjection of women to the rule of men. This is like another note of hypocrisy on the part of men, because here we have her father who really wants her to stay home and take care of him, although they do have kind of a comradely relationship, no pun intended. But this idea of at least being cognizant and at least being somewhat aware of the many ways in which women were at the mercy of men at this point in time in the 1930s. Okay, we're going to look at the next example. This is, again, Ida's part, and she's reflecting on Mildred Bevel, who we will hear from in the fourth part. But she's reflecting on the way that Mildred, in many ways, really becomes the central figure in the first two books. And that was something that I myself had experienced. This is part of the reason why I was able to identify with Ida, is at some point you do get the sense that Mildred is very much at the center of the first two books. But you also have this sense of her both being there and also being kind of absent. You can't really get a sense of who she is. So we have this on page 248. Helen, Benjamin Rask's wife, was the absolute center of the book for me. I was quick to identify with her. We were both young women trying to grow in narrow crevices, hoping to break and expand them in the process. And I felt that Vanner, always keeping a respectful distance, understood her. And through her, me. And then across the page, we have this. Although it was a work of fiction, the book had convinced me that I was in possession of some essential truth about his life. I was still unable to see just what this truth might be, but this did not prevent me from believing I had somehow the upper hand. So this is very important. This is the end of a paragraph. She feels like she has the upper hand, which is very significant because the man that she has the upper hand over is Andrew Bevel, who is this incredibly powerful person. And for his secretary to feel like she has the upper hand is really significant. So I loved, it's late in the book. It's like page 250, but we are having this very satisfying, prominence of women and also the sort of an honest take on the fact that Mildred is both at the center, but also absent. The last example we'll look at is on 284. So this, one of the subplots has to do with Ida and her suitor. And I felt like some of these parts were a bit sketched in. Like I didn't fully really like dig in to their romance. I wasn't really like sucked in. I didn't like get their chemistry, but I really did enjoy the way that he was kind of a foil for her in the sense that, she wanted to be independent and he didn't want her to. And so there were these, slightly obvious, but these important scenes where Ida would be asserting her, kind of feminist independence with this suitor. Come here, he said, and hugged me. Want to cuddle a little? I did not. My lack of response and slight stiffness were enough to make that clear. He let go with a grunt and left. I rolled up the type pages and shoved them inside the sleeve of a raincoat deep in my closet. So I love this. We have this rejection here of him, and he makes kind of a grunt. He's like kind of a Neanderthalish kind of guy, it sounds like. And then he leaves, which is excellent because we have this idea that that's exactly what she wanted. I mean, she's really not letting him take advantage of her. But then we have this idea also of her rolling these important papers into a somewhat phallic, thing, and then inserting them, which is also phallic. I would be very tempted here to do a very Freudian reading of this and say that, in fact, when she is, rolling these papers into a tube, essentially, which is a very phallic symbol, and then when she's shoving them into the sleeve of her raincoat, this is it's a very sexualized thing that is happening. And I like the idea of that happening because, in fact, she is the one with the penis, and she is the one who is taking on the masculine role here soon after having, banished this guy. Gosh, I wish I could talk talk to Hernan Diaz and ask him maybe, I mean, not even so much like if he meant that, but like if he believes that this could have been, you know, some sort of a Freudian thing. I mean, obviously Hernan Diaz is you know, a sophisticated guy who's studied a lot of philosophy. So he certainly has, I'm sure he has an opinion. Okay. In order to avoid ending on the note of like a very questionable Freudian reading of a somewhat sexualized interaction, I would just say at the close here that what Hernan Diaz has done is so interesting. And it is a book that really rewards our deep dive into it, certainly, but also is one that is unique, I think. And that it really, you know, if you can dig into this in a way that is informed and is detective-like, it is a book that really makes you appreciate what fiction can do. I mean, it is important to look at all of these 4 sections. You have, you know, the novel, the memoir, the historical document, and the journal or diary. All of these are fictions. They are all things that Hernan Diaz has made up. But I really do believe that he has tested some of our notions about how we read different pieces of literature. Most of all, though, it's this really, I mean, there's a lot of just really good old-fashioned storytelling here. And it is complemented by this incredible structure that I think stretches us as readers while also being really rewarding. So thank you for tuning in, and head straight back to the Foxed page. Find something else to listen to. Happy reading.